Hello, everyone. This is Alfredo Abate, your current Chicago Oracle Users Group President. Welcome to today's webinar. As an attendee, you'll be in listen-only mode. You can ask questions in the chat window, which we will monitor. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. We'll also be streaming live on our YouTube channel, and the recording will be available shortly after the presentation is finished, so you can view it at any time or if you want to review anything. It's really great to be here with you today, virtually, as the group hasn't met in person since last August. For those that are new to the Chicago Oracle Users Group, we welcome you. Traditionally, our group meets between 4 to 6 times a year in various locations around the Chicagoland suburbs for presentations, as well as hands-on workshops by Oracle experts, ACEs, authors. With the restrictions in place due to COVID, we decided to go virtual to continue to deliver awesome technical content to our members. Today is our 7th webinar in a series of 20 that we'll be holding until November 18th. You can look at our entire schedule on our website. We will have the September registration links ready by the end of this week. Our website is COUG.us. It's also in front of you right now. Our user group runs completely unfunded. Our members don't pay any dues, and our meetings have always been free. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, OAppsNet Partners. They are an Oracle Gold partner and systems integrator with specialties in areas of financial business solutions based on Oracle applications, both on premises and in the cloud. They provide services in the areas of AP automation, Apex development, database upgrades, and administration. Next week, don't miss our webinar with software performance specialist Carrie Millsap on some things you probably didn't know about Oracle tracing. This should be a really good one. You can register for that on our website right now. Today, we have the pleasure of having Jessica Sharp present to us on Postgres for the Oracle DBA. When she's not wrangling database issues, she's wrangling her small zoo at home, which includes birds, snakes, and spiders. Jessica, welcome. I'm going to give you control of the screen.
Thanks, Alfredo. All right, let me get the Zoom links going here. So Alfredo mentioned that I wrangle birds, snakes, and spiders, and this is true. This is when I'm not tackling databases, I go relax by wrestling with, well, I don't wrestle, but sometimes we do. I've got one that's sick and he's getting injections and not liking it. I thought I was going to show up today with my first snake bite. Didn't happen. We're good. Thanks for Alfredo for the invite to do this today. Doing presentations outside of work and for outside of customers really means a lot to me. It gives me energy, keeps me going. It's my way of staying in touch with the community, which I've been deeply involved in the Oracle community, and now I'm getting deeply involved into the Postgres community, and I miss the Oracle folks. So I'm glad that I had the opportunity to do presentations like this. And thank you to the OAppsNet partners for sponsoring, because I fully understand these things would not happen without sponsors. All right, so I just mentioned Postgres, just mentioned Oracle. This presentation is Postgres for the Oracle DBA. And before I tell you more about why I'm talking about this and who I am, can we get it? Don't be shy, just put it in the chat or the Q&A. What are some of your roles? Are you DBAs who are in hybrid environments now and need to learn how to deal with the Postgres side? Are you developers who need to know how to deal with Postgres? Are you architects trying to design solutions? And I'll wait a few moments, but go ahead and just let me know. We've got a DBA for Oracle, Postgres, and MySQL. Ooh. Oracle DBA, security engineer, Oracle DBA, DBA moving to Postgres, DBA architect. Cool. Okay, so a lot of DBAs, a lot of architects dabbling in Postgres. Very cool. It's a fun thing to dabble with. Okay. So if you're here, some of you are dabbling, that's fine. You're getting a head start. I highly recommend doing that. It's a lot more fun that way than just being thrown into the deep end. Most of the people that I talk to on a daily basis come to me because somebody in their organization with authority decided that Oracle got too expensive, or somebody's ego got hurt by some sort of licensing arrangement or something. And I can't knock it. I understand, you know, gotta save money, cool stuff. I was a weirdo who partially started seeking out Postgres projects for somewhat political reasons. I wanted to be part of a more open software, and Postgres truly is that. The development around the Postgres is highly democratic, and not in the way that our government is right now. It's a lot more efficient. So I'm a senior managing consultant for EDB. I like to refer to them as one of the Postgres motherships. I'm told I'm probably not supposed to refer to us that way because then it makes us feel like Oracle, but realistically, that's what we are. I'm actually fairly new to the company. I just started doing this. I joined EDB last April, and before that I was an independent Oracle Exadata consultant. So major shift. I've fairly recently been through all of this, and I feel like it's really important to help other Oracle DBAs and architects transition in situations where they do have hybrid shops and they need to know how to manage both, or if they're just playing around and maybe they want to pick up a Postgres contract, you know, especially if you're independent, it's a nice way to keep the bills paid. And I struggled in 2016, 17. I lived in Dallas and was really busy with Oracle projects for a while. They were really fun. They were complicated. I had good challenges to solve, and things kind of started slowing down, and it got painful, and I was all of a sudden needing to know another database. So even if you don't think you need to know another database right now, it's always helpful to at least know how to figure it out and get a head start in case something ever should come up. So EDB, we have, I want to get this out of the way because we're going to get to a point in the slides where I'm going to have to talk to some things instead of showing visuals, and this is why. EDB has taken the core code, the community Postgres code, and they've made some modifications, and because of the licensing, they're allowed to do this. They can't resell it as Postgres, and they can never merge these changes back into the core community version. It's what we call the enterprise version, and of course you pay for this. You pay for our tools that we've developed on top of this. And I live in both of these worlds. I live in the enterprise Postgres world, and I live in the community Postgres world. I prefer the enterprise version strongly because we've got a lot of really cool tools, but I wanted to focus this presentation on the community spirit and only the open source stuff. So even for me, still a year into this, separating the two technologies gets a little hairy. So I'm going to do my best to help you figure out how to navigate the Postgres space in case you start running into any of the same confusions. So I've got, what is going on? Can't hit the next slide. There we go. Okay. So this slide is it's actually a YouTube video. So if you go to the slides later, there's a link in the speaker notes, and I think you can just press play on this. I'm not going to press play because this is a whole hour video on its own, but look it up. It's really cool. This is Dr. Michael Stonebreaker is one, well, not one of, he is the main architect for Postgres. And this, he shares his story of how Postgres came about, how the need came to his attention, and kind of what was going on in his life at the time. It's a really cute, heartwarming story. So Dr. Michael Stonebreaker, this goes all the way back to Ted COUG and System R. If you're not familiar with that, it's kind of cool. It's cool. I would just do a quick Google search. It's pretty well documented. So Dr. Michael Stonebreaker was reading about this research project called System R. This was one of the first relational data storage and retrieval systems. He took what he liked about it, and I'm sure Ted COUG had influence as well. This was right around the time when he was doing his research and publishing things like, the 12 rules for databases. So Dr. Michael Stonebreaker architected Ingress. And here we go again. I can't get the next slide. No. Okay, there we go. Ingress. It stands for Interactive Graphics and Retrieval System. It's not a random slew of letters. And knowing this history is an important part of interacting with the Postgres community. And we'll get to that. But so Ingress was an academic project. It didn't, well, it lasted a while. Dr. Michael Stonebreaker's involvement only lasted a few years before he moved on and very creatively renamed the project Post-Ingress to represent expanding on Ingress in a more commercial way. He was switching gears here. He was still involved in self-education and believed in, okay, he's an academic at heart, but he wanted to turn this around and offer this to companies and businesses. So this was post-Ingress. When this started really taking off, when they got their first customers, he shortened it to Postgres, dropped the I, Postgres. Makes sense, right? So this was where the key expansion and the key building on the Ingress system was where the addition of the object-oriented programming really came into play. There was a lot of buzz around it, a lot of excitement, and right around 95, well, we all remember the Windows 95 trend, right? They took the same naming convention and quickly realized that Postgres 95 was going to be quickly outdated. So you won't hear this very often. They fairly quickly, especially as SQL started getting popular, they moved along to a more classic, a name that would stand the test of time. And this is how we ended up with PostgresSQL. Hot topic in the Postgres community. If you refer to it as Postgres, you're okay. If you refer to it as PostgresSQL, you're okay. And that's how it's pronounced, by the way. It's not, oh man, I even practiced and I can't pronounce it incorrectly. Okay, I'm not gonna try, but these are the two names. And now the Postgres community as a whole came together, and because they couldn't make up their minds, there was too much bickering, too much back and forth about, do we call it Postgres or do we call it PostgresSQL? PostgresSQL is the official name, but because old habits die hard and so many people were stuck calling it Postgres, they have adopted Postgres as an official alias. But don't call it anything else. Don't do it, especially not in a community forum. Postgres people are very, very, very dedicated to high quality, do your research. So I just want to give you a little warning. Postgres people can come across as kind of rude sometimes, and this is a touchy thing that triggers it. So if you're well prepared, if I can do anything, then this is good. So with that community spirit, this is one of my favorite things about Postgres. It is not driven by financial needs. That's also kind of a downside, because you can go to the Postgres community and you can say, well, I've got this customer who's paying this much money and they need this feature. And that doesn't necessarily mean the development community is going to care. You've got to put forth an actual case for your requested feature, or bugs are usually a lot easier to get the approval for. But there is a process here, and it's very what's best for everybody, not necessarily what's best for whoever has the most amount of money. That's something I like. But because of, the Postgres people, just as a whole, not everybody, obviously not everybody, but the development group and the official team responsible for managing Postgres, go to postgresql.org, by the way. They've got all of their information. You can learn how to identify who those people are if you go to that page. But my takeaway when interacting with anybody in the Oracle community, just be zen. Don't take anything personally. Most of them are great people. They have good hearts, especially if you talk to them, outside of, hey, fix X, Y, and Z. Just have casual interactions. Most of them are on Twitter. They're all pretty friendly. Just things get heated sometimes. Don't take it personally. Make sure you ask good questions. They've even got in the documentation somewhere, they've got tips and guidelines for how to ask a good question. There are mailing lists, and this is how most of everything happens in the Postgres community. So you can go to postgresql.org, and just the links are all pretty straightforward. Just follow the links, register. You can subscribe to the mailing lists. These are public channels. Be careful, be very careful. You cannot have something that you say in there deleted. They won't even entertain the idea. It's not going to happen. Embarrassing things happen on these threads. Learn to let it go. Just learn to let it go. But this is also where you get tied to what's coming up, performance things that people need help with. Pretty much there's a mailing list for almost anything. I would recommend subscribing to a few. Just pick a few of your favorite, like 3 or 4 of your favorite topics, things that you're deeply curious about. They do have a security mailing list. That one's actually very interesting to follow. They're all pretty active. Just watch for a while. Just read. One of my favorite places to learn about Postgres besides the documentation. So my dream for Postgres is that we get more and more cross-community cooperation. This is not a stab at the author of this article, but there was somebody from Second Quadrant. They're one of the other, corporate. They have an advanced version of Postgres, and they offer their own tools, and they do consulting just like EDB does. They had a blog post about their version of reasons to migrate from Oracle to Postgres. Now, this is the author's opinion, obviously. This is not a reflection of Second Quadrant, but it is on their page. Frank Pasho, I love him. He's amazing. He promenaded in multiple databases. Well worth a follow if you don't already. How he has the time to keep an eye on so many different things in so many different communities, I will never understand. But he responded. He responded as an Oracle DBA to a Postgres person, and things got a little heated, and there was a little bit of drama, especially behind the scenes. Now, I thought Frank was very respectful, and I thought absolutely professional, but he was absolutely correct. And somebody needed to point out his list of of reasons. There were certain things that the author didn't understand about Oracle correctly, certain terms he used that were not necessarily widely used in either database community, therefore leading to some confusion. Crap. If you hear my birds in the background, I'm sorry. I put them in the other room for this, but I just heard them, so apologies if that comes up. I would like to see more of this, honestly. Respectful exchanges of ideas between the database communities. We absolutely need people like Frank Pashos coming in and saying, hey, actually, there is a legitimate need for this in Postgres. This is how we're using it in Oracle. And if somebody, more of us can come to the Postgres community and explain things like that and even contribute directly, Postgres is going to fly. Like that's the magic of this, because it's a community process. If we bring people who have other perspectives brought from other database softwares, I think we're going to see some amazing things over the next 5 years. PostgresSQL license, it's similar to the MIT, it's a pretty open license. It's really short. This slide is intentionally blank because that's what reading the license feels like. It's just look it up. It's about a paragraph, and the paragraph is really meaningless to the average eye. Okay, so obvious at this point, this is a free database. You're probably stuck with it. What now? The word free to me, I tried many different words, and this was something that held me back from picking up Postgres as one of my, the tricks in my tool bag, because free just doesn't sound good, right? Free makes you think, what's wrong with it? Why is it free? Why am I not paying a lot of money for this? I tried cheap, that sounded even worse. I tried open, and every negative connotation that I could possibly dream up in my wildly imaginative mind about open source things came up. And one of the other things that held me back was I immediately thought, how dare anybody try to make money off of an open source product? It's free, it should stay free, right? Well, that's where I realized maybe this isn't a bad thing, because you're still, you're not paying for it. Does that mean it's necessarily a backhanded move to ask for money for supporting this free database? No, I don't think so. And when it sounds silly, but I had to almost tell myself that out loud. And then I realized, like, oh yeah, also as a DBA, what do I care? I'm not getting any money from Oracle for their database sale, license sales anyway. So why not give my customers a free option and then charge them for support, or any additional tools that I would be charging for as an Oracle consultant anyway. So first things first, you've got this free database in front of you. The documentation is amazing, but until you get familiar with it, it can feel like it's all over the place. So if you need to install your database, if you're just playing around, or this is a new thing that you've been asked to deploy, there are a few different ways that you can do it. I am putting together some automated scripts on my personal GitHub page. You can just search for, I think, sharp DBA. But because I have templated default parameters that I use, and because the install steps can be a little different if you do it the way I do it, depending on your OS or your Linux distribution, I've got a lot more work to do, and this year has been absolutely bonkers with people migrating to Postgres. So it's not available yet because I want to put something that actually works out there. But most operating systems do come with the Postgres package bundled with it, especially like Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu. Be careful with the Debian distros. They're fine if you're just using a basic, if you just want a core, a database only situation. If you want to add any monitoring or other tools, the Debian packages they're maintained, obviously, but because it's not as common as Red Hat Enterprise Linux, for example, things don't always get pushed. Like I'll give you an example. EDB has a monitoring tool. We very creatively call it PEM instead of OEM. To install PEM, we need the SSL utils package, and it's specific to Postgres, supposed to be bundled with Postgres. It's documented as being bundled with the community. If you pull the community package from the repository in the documentation, it's supposed to have that SSL utils package in there. And the reason that this collaboration was supposed to happen is because because the Postgres development is open to anybody, we do have somebody from our company that is a Postgres contributor. And guess what? He helps with the packaging. So he made this happen. But on the later releases, oops. So the SSL utils package is not there. You basically have to use the advanced server, which is, we don't charge licensing for it, but that's a whole other slew of stuff. So just do a yum update and then just do yum install Postgres to install the one that came with your OS. It's probably not going to be the most up to date, but it'll get you going. So, okay, once you go through, also check the documentation. There's a 1-page, installing Postgres is really fast. It's really simple. It's the configuring it that takes a little bit longer. But once you just follow those steps, get it installed, get it started up, and I've got some tricks on that in a second. How do you know it's running? How do you know it worked? You can always do your PSEF grep, and you want to grep on Postgres. And if it shows the Postgres services or processes, sorry, you're good. And it'll also show you the key there, the key process that you want to look for. And it's 2020. I have a problem with this name because we've realized some stuff as a whole lately. The key process is called the postmaster. That's the one that kind of manages all your background processes. So that's if your postmaster isn't running, your database isn't running. And the quickest way to identify your postmaster is it will be appended with a -d, and it'll specify the data directory. And it'll say, okay, the data directory, well, now I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, I'll press pause because this will make sense in a few slides. You can also use service control, just do a status on it that way. I prefer service control if I'm on Linux because you can script. This is easier to just have your Postgres start up when your server boots up automatically versus using the PG control status. Yeah, you can script it, but it's a little more complicated. If you do have to be root, obviously, to use the service control status command. And for the PG control, if you've done a default installation, it's going to create a Postgres user on your OS, and your database will by default be called Postgres, and it will by default create a user called Postgres. The Postgres user is the super user. So it's your big DBA account. You'll want to log into your OS as Postgres, and then you can run your PG control status. And the -d, you want to specify -d because it says, hey, PG control, please look in this data directory. And then you pass the PG data path. And if it says you're good, you're good. If not, it gives you, it doesn't always give you a helpful error. If this is your first go at it, you've probably not configured your logging. So it's probably not going to tell you where to go to check. You'll want to go into your data directory, And in there, there's a subdirectory for logs. Just check your logs and see what happened. All right, so important processes. The postmaster, don't like the name of it. I haven't heard anything about renaming it. It is what it is for now. So this is what launches your other processes. This is your background processes and session processes. You'll see your writer processes. These are where your database writes, your log writes, and your checkpoints are going to go through. And then you've got your stat collector processes, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's collecting information about the server activity. And then you've got user session processes. Okay, so now you've probably got enough. You can log in using pSQL, the Postgres version of your SQL Plus. It's gonna look confusing your first time. You're gonna log in. Now, here's the logical architecture. This is not my picture. This is, I believe he's a doctor. He's not a medical doctor. He's a doctor in computer science. Dr. Suzuki's The Internals of Postgres. I think it's a book, but there's an online copy. He's the founder of the Japanese Postgres user group, and he wrote a book that is highly recommended, but it's in Japanese and he hasn't done an English version. So for his English speaking community members, he put together a sort of supplemental guide to his book, and it's available just openly in English on his website. So I pulled this image from there because it's one of the best that I've found so far. Definitely check it out. There's a link. He goes over a lot of really high level concepts in a really very clear way. Okay, so you've got your database cluster. Now the word cluster for Postgres people really can apply to anything. It's a pet peeve. It just doesn't mean anything. So from a logical perspective, initially going into this, I thought of this like, okay, I've got my database cluster, and then I've got sort of like my little pluggable databases. And I thought I was good to go. I thought I understood. It's not, it's kind of, but not so much. And here's why, because of the physical architecture. Again, I pulled this from his site. It's one of the best, easiest to follow diagrams that I've seen. So I use it, want to give credit where it's due. So hopefully we can see my mouse. Earlier I had mentioned the PG data directory. That's your base directory. That's going to be where you want to start out. This, you'll want to read the documentation on this. This took me a while to, I understood it when I read it, but trying to actually wrap my head around it was a little bit more complicated. So the PG data base directory is where your control files and your cluster configuration files are. So you don't have a separate configuration file or a separate set of parameters for each actual database. They all share one set of parameters, and that's going to be in your base directory. You've got some subdirectories in there. Now, when I say control files, it's not, it means something entirely different. What the control files are, they are not the main configuration file. Your main configuration file is also in the base directory. That's your PostgresSQL conf file over here. Be very careful with this file. Back it up regularly. Try not to touch it. It's just, be careful. The control files, there are some examples, but there are a lot of them. So check the documentation. In the example here, he's got the global. This is going to be where your system-wide table files are stored. So this is all of your information about all the databases in the cluster. So you can't create, like here you've got sample DB and test DB. If you log into test DB, you can't see any information about sample DB because that information is here in your, I don't want to call it the container database, but it kind of is. And that's the only database that has access to the information in this global table here. And I'm calling it a table for simplicity's sake. It's not actually organized as a table. There are tables in there. That's going to be your metadata and your system catalogs, things like that. Over here, you got your PG logical. This is where your status for your logical decoding is. And then PG stat is your permanent files for the statistics subsystem. And then there are a lot more, but just keep a cheat sheet near you. So in the PG data directory, there's a base. Well, it's called a base directory. This is where your databases are physically. So each database here gets a physical directory. These numbers, that's the OID for your database. I very rarely physically navigate into these directories. If you need to, and if you need to cross-reference which database this is, because you're only familiar with the the human-friendly name, you just go back and you want to query against some tables in your global. Well, Google around, because now that I'm saying that out loud, I'm realizing pSQL gives you some shortcuts that you don't actually have to query. You could just do like a -L and it'll list out all the databases. And there's some cool things like that. So each of the databases, I should mention this, each of the databases does have its own system catalog. So you won't necessarily be able to drill down in detail if you're up in your main database. That'll just give you general information about all of them. If you want to know specific things about tables or users in TestDB, you need to connect to TestDB and query the catalogs in there. So, okay, so that's all fine and dandy. One thing that is not depicted in this is the redo logs and in Postgres, that's going to be your write ahead logging. There's another directory in here for those. You can move those out. Technically you can put those anywhere you want to. I don't recommend it. If you Google it, you will see some advice saying, yeah, move your WAL, your write ahead log directory out, put it somewhere else, and they'll quote all sorts of performance reasons, and they'll say put it on a different disk because the IO pattern is different. The IO pattern is different for writes. Not necessarily true in the newer versions. You can leave it in here, but be wary of your disk space. All right, so if you don't like the default, if you don't like where your base directory is, and some reasons that you may not like this, I'm looking ahead and something has happened to my next slide. That doesn't look pretty. That's great. Anyways, if you are needing to separate your resource, well, let's go back. All right, so I am not justifying this. There are some things I like about Oracle, but if you've got a database and you're all in one PG data, right, your base directory is the same. Everything in there is going to share. It all has the same set of processes. There's no separate process for this specific DB, no set of specific processes for this DB. They all share. So if for some reason, and I've never actually seen it happen yet, but if you're not comfortable with that, if you need solid resource separation, you can install a second Postgres database, but you'll need to alter the base directory. So that's where this would come into play. Or if you just don't like the directory, I've done that too. There is a solution. You create the directory that you want it to be in. And then when you run your PG control, and then you give it the init DB. This is initialize a DB. You say -d for, hey, this is the data directory for my database. And then you specify the desired directory. And then that's it, you're good. Now, if you run your ps, ef, grep, Postgres, you'll get to postmasters, and it'll tell you, hey, this postmaster, this ID, and this postmaster is running for this directory, and a few lines down, it'll say, yep, it's also running for this directory. So if you forget where your directory is, ps, ef, grep, Postgres, favorite way to do it. All right, so back to the PG data, the base directory. There's a lot in there. If you're just getting started, this is what I want you to pay attention to. This is what's important. Your pg conf file. These are your real, this is what you're going to focus on, this and the PostgresSQL conf to configure your database. There's no listener with Postgres. So authentication, by default, when you install it, if you're accessing it from a local server, you can get in. But I had an interesting thing come up. Thank you, Bobby Curtis, the other day. Once you start doing things like trying to access it from different servers, like if you've got a database in the cloud, or you've got one on a VM somewhere, or gosh, if this is a real, dev or test deployment that you're working on and your application needs to connect, this is the second thing that you'll edit. So check the documentation on here. The syntax is pretty forgiving. It's pretty simple, and that's why I'm not going to go into it. It's a quick Google search. Open up this file. You add, you say, hey, I'm connecting from either, host, I want to allow connections from everywhere, or those are the two that I frequently use. So it's basically a whitelist. So you go through, you say, hey, this is where I'm connecting from, allow connections for this user or all users, or groups or roles, you can do that too. And then you say, allow connections from this IP address. Watch out, you can't just use the IP address. You have to specify octets. You have to have that -32 or -0 or whatever. And then the last column in there that you'll see is the authentication method. If this is your local machine, leave it alone. Just leave it alone. You're fine. If this is a cloud, like for example, I've got some compute instances in the Google Cloud, and I've got some EC2 instances in AWS. For those, I just go in and I say, hey, allow connections from to the host, from any user to any database. And then I say, allow connections from 0.0.0.0/0. And then for the very last column, I say, trust all. I don't want any peer authentication or anything, just trust it all. Not secure. Don't do that for an actual database. That is only acceptable for your playground, and not really if you really care about security. But to get up and going, that's how you're going to do it. Check the documentation on it. It's pretty clear, pretty easy, pretty cool. If you can use virtual IPs or something if you've got a real environment that you're working on, just in case if you've got a situation where you can't really rely on server IPs, I would recommend using the virtual IPs, or host names are okay as well. But there, I would recommend that you fully qualify, just to keep it, you just don't want to be accidentally connecting from the wrong place. So, okay, so your other most important thing is your PostgresSQL.conf. This is where you set all of your configuration parameters. By default, and this is kind of weird, but by default, it looks like everything is commented out. Ignore it, it's fine. uncomment what you want. I have a kind of a standard of best practices configuration file that I use. And what I do, I never, ever, ever, unless the client really, really needs me to, but I usually can talk them out of it. I don't wipe the PostgresSQL conf. How this works is it reads from top to bottom. Whatever is at the bottom, even if it's exactly the same as what's at the top, the bottommost entry is gospel truth. So what I do is I walk around with a cleaner version of default parameters. The only things I will change before I install this for a customer is the memory settings, obviously. The other thing in here is the listen address. By default, it's set to localhost. But if you wanted to specify an IP address for it to listen on, you would change that in there too. So sometimes I change that before I deploy this. But you have your configuration file, you put it in the base directory, in the PG data directory. And then at the bottom, the very, 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 very bottom of the PostgresSQL conf, you go down and you say include equals, and then single quotes, and you specify, you give it the name of your configuration file, and it will read yours. And any parameters that you have in yours that are also, well, they don't even have to be, but if they are also in the PostgresSQL conf, it'll take yours because yours are now at the bottom. So it'll take yours top to bottom and count your whole file as at the bottom of the original. So you could daisy chain parameter files. I wouldn't recommend doing that, but I like doing it this way with only one file because then if I've got a bad parameter in there, or the customer wants to go back to the original, hasn't happened yet, but I want to give them the option. All they have to do is comment out that includes in the PostgresSQL conf, or just delete my file. It doesn't care. So watch out for the .conf files. If you're inheriting an environment, make sure to catch them all, back them all up, know what's going on in there. The PostgresSQL.autoconf, don't open this. Don't open it. Don't do it. I have several colleagues who prefer to alter system parameters through the pSQL prompt, and you can do this. And I have a kind of hairy example coming up, but the PostgresSQL autoconf file is where the system stores parameters changed via that method. The postmaster.opts, yeah, it's more of an auditing thing. If you pass specific parameters as you're starting the database, it'll log things there so that if anything happens, you can look and say, oh, well, we're missing a puzzle piece here. I've never had to use that because that's kind of a silly way to start databases. I think if you're going to start it, put your options in your parameter files, but hey, wanted to point it out in case it ever comes up for you. Okay, so to change anything, to alter system, any parameters from the pSQL prompt, this is what it looks like. So this first box, I'm just checking, this is my query that I keep on hand. Select name, context, unit, setting, boot val, reset val from PG settings. And PG settings is a table in that global directory in the PG base that we talked about. So this is an example of one of the many. And then where name in, and these are the parameter names. This is not a conclusive list. I needed to make this fit on one screen and give an easy example. So your first column here, name of the parameter. Context, this is kind of cool. This shows you what this parameter applies to. So here on our first line here, it says listen, oops, don't click, Jessica. It says listen addresses. This is the one where I was talking about. Usually it's localhost, and in my example, you can see unit is blank, sorry, setting. This is the actual value. Mine is set to localhost. I pulled this from my laptop. If you wanted to change it to listen to an actual IP address, that's where you could do it. Context, this parameter applies to the postmaster. So this applies for the whole database, you can't get around it. Work mem, the third one down here, the context is the user. You can set different work mem values for, you can limit it to specific users. I'm logged in here as the Postgres user, which is the super user. So, and I'm also searching for, I think, I'm not searching for user specific. This is just a basic query, but you could build on this query to pull user specific things. And I also have not shown how to adjust it per user. You'll want to do a little bit of digging for that. The unit, kilobytes, that's fine. Setting, what it's actually set to at the time. If we reboot the server, that's the boot val, that's what it's going to come up as. If I reset, so what this, if I choose to reset, then it removes, it clears that PostgreSQL auto conf, and it pushes it back to what's in the PostgreSQL conf. What is it going to set it back to? Easy, that's the reset val. So here, I've gone ahead and I've said alter system set work mem equals 8192. Fine, okay. Some settings, some parameters, you have to restart the database for. In the PostgreSQL conf, in the default one, it has a comment at the end of each line, and it'll tell you if you have to restart the database. If it doesn't say you have to restart it, a reload is fine. So you can reload either with the PG control or, well, yeah, PG control. Or if you're already in pSQL, you can call the pg reload config function, and that'll do the same thing. A reload will not disconnect anybody. Nobody's going to notice anything. Restart, obviously that's downtime. And we can see here that, okay, 8192, I've run my same select query, user, the value is 8192. Okay, but let's say I didn't actually want to change it. That was silly. So what am I going to do? I'm going to say alter system reset work mem, alter system. And because the reset value was 40, you know, the default 4096, I'm going to say, okay, select pg reload conf function. And then down here we can see it went back to the original value. Fun stuff, play with it, it's cool. We are going to go back to my physical architecture diagram that is not mine, yay community efforts, because I want to call something out. Obviously, there's a little table space box out kind of to the side. This feels kind of random. It's not. Table spaces are stored separately. So I don't see it used very often. There's no default table space. Your files by default are go into PG database, go into your database. That's where your table files are stored. If you explicitly create a table space and specify the directory where you want to store those files, that's how you end up with this little guy over here. Does not have to be on the same server, but if you're going to do cross server or cross disk files, I would read up on it, because you're going to need to do some performance tuning, and I'm not talking about that today. So do some research. All right, so redo and archiving. You have to do a little bit of configuration for this. Go back to your PostgreSQL conf. If you want to archive your write-ahead logging files, you'll need to add the command to execute archiving. It's just a bash command. Yeah, you have to write it, sorry. Maybe one day they'll change that. I don't think so though. And then you don't have redo files, you have, I keep talking about this and I haven't explained it yet, the write-ahead logging, or as it's verbally pronounced, the WAL files. This is where the transactions are logged before any transactions are actually written to disk. So with your WAL, your main parameters to look at, your WAL level, and this is all in the PostgresSQL conf, you've got your WAL level. By default, it's set to replica. What this is this tells the database how much information to actually, how much transaction information to actually log. So if it's okay to leave it at the default. I typically do, unless there's a specific use case not to. Doesn't happen very often. If you're going to use replication, because how that works is the database, the primary database sends the WAL files to the standby and applies the transactions via the information in the WALs. So your default level of WAL level equals replica, puts enough information in the WALs that your standby can successfully replicate, not as random as it sounds. All right, the fsync parameter, which I have so graciously misspelled, don't turn that off. If you turn that off, you're high risk for losing data. This says write to disk, force a write to disk before we count any information as actually real information about the transactions. So do your research, don't turn it off. Synchronous commit, what this does, I would leave it alone. This is not a parameter that I typically recommend, again, unless there's a specific, like a weird edge case. Synchronous commit, if you're replicating, this waits for the changes to be applied to your standby before it comes back and says, okay, yes, cycle complete. If you have any network latency, your replication is you're gonna have a lot of fun troubleshooting that, and you may miss some data. You're gonna have some performance problems and some lag problems if you've got synchronous commit enabled. Checkpoint timeout. I've got, this is one of those things that I explain over and over and over again, and it still baffles everybody, including myself sometimes. So check my speaker notes for this. By default, checkpoint timeout is 300 seconds. This is in seconds unless you specify another unit. And I realize we're getting short on time, so I'm trying to get through this. What this does is this says, okay, this is the maximum time allowed between WAL checkpoints. So if you increase this beyond this 300 seconds and something goes down, you may not have, you may have some data loss or longer time needed to recover because you'll have to do some manual checking on your WAL files, but it won't necessarily recycle your files every 5 minutes. And I really got to work on that explanation. I'm sorry. Your min WAL size. That's backwards. The minimum WAL size is actually 80 megabytes and the max is 1 gigabyte. So the minimum says, hey, when we reach the max size, we're going to make space again. If you're not archiving, your WALs are going to clear out, that's gone. If you archive, this will roll over, refresh your WAL space, but you'll still have the history available for any recovery purposes. The minimum WAL size, which should be 80 megabytes, says, I'm never going to give up. Like, you're always going to have at least an 80 megabyte space for WALs. I was on mute. Hello, Slack. So check the mailing list archives. Kind of funny thing. This email thread the max wall senders must die. That is the actual name of the email thread. Google this. It's worth it. I promise. It's a laugh. These guys sound kind of grumpy. This is Bruce Momgen and Tom Lane. I like to call them the godfathers of Postgres. Bruce felt like the max wall senders parameter was irrelevant, and Tom said no, because you can't just have unlimited walls, then you're gonna run into memory issues and whatnot. They're great guys. This email thread makes them sound a little more hostile than they are. Neither of them are like that. This is just a reminder of when you are watching these threads, just don't take this stuff personally. These guys are not, sometimes things come out wrong, and it's not how they are. It's not an attack. Just don't get upset about things in the community. It's not as, sarcasm doesn't always come well over emails. All right, so roll back and undo. Good God, Slack. Your table growth is dynamic. Transaction information is stored in the file with the data. And what this means, so transaction information gets a transaction ID, and when you reach the maximum, it's some large number. Check Bruce Momgen's blog. I forget what the number is, but he talks about it a bit. If you don't do maintenance on your database, your transaction ID can't wrap around and refresh itself. So it'll crash your database, but the maintenance that you need to do sounds kind of funny. I'm being serious. You vacuum your database. So if you have updates, deletes, this is going to force the recovery of usable space after you've reused what is called a tuple, which is a row, but it's really just the space for that row. So some high-level reasons to use the vacuum: to recover or reuse disk space occupied by updated or deleted rows. You can update or delete a row, but the weird thing is it doesn't actually completely release the space back. Like it does, you can put more data there, but your transaction IDs and some other data start building up. So your watermark never goes below what you've already used. Even if you clean it up, the watermark doesn't drop back down unless you do a full vacuum, but we'll talk about that in a second. You also need to vacuum to update data statistics, which same as Oracle, used by the query planner, or again, to prevent against loss of data due to the transaction ID wraparound. Standard vacuum is the way to go. You can automate this. This can run in parallel with your database operations. This isn't going to affect anybody except for altering your table structures. So you can't go add a table, you can't change, can't add a column, things like that. You don't do other maintenance while your vacuum is going. Slack, jeez. It is CPU intensive. So don't try it. If you're gonna schedule a vacuum, schedule it at an alternate time from your backup. Don't do it in the middle of the day when you've got a bunch of users on. Also, don't just rely on the scheduled vacuum, because you could have unexpected bursts of activity. So this is called bloat. The vacuum is cleaning up the database bloat. If you want to do a Google search on it that way, use the word bloat. Be proactive about it, monitor it. You don't have to check it 500 times a day, but have some sort of monitoring and alerting to account for unexpected bloat, because you may have to manually vacuum. Full vacuums is your maximum space recovery, but it takes the longest and it requires an exclusive table lock. This is downtime. Do your standard vacuuming, stay on top of it so that you don't have to do full vacuums. So here's a list of routine maintenance. Vacuuming, updating the planner statistics. Well, vacuuming kind of takes care of that. So I would still do it, but maybe not as aggressively if you know your vacuum is on top of things. Because of the short explanation, because of the vacuuming, you may have some reindexing needs. And this, as an Oracle DBA, I know can blow some people's minds. Just check it. Just check the last time your indexes were used every now and then. If they haven't been used in a while, consider doing something about it. You also need to do log file maintenance. That's a manual effort. You can automate it again, but it is something that you do need to look out for. You can configure, you can customize log files, obviously logging levels and things like that. You can customize the format of your log files. If you want some cheat sheets on how to do that, just Google. The Postgres documentation has a pretty good, give me a second. That is going to drive me absolutely bonkers. Postgres documentation has some good cheat sheets on it, but EDB also has, just do a search on our website. We've got some cheat sheets on it too, and there are a few community members that the core contributors have some GitHub. To change anything, you're going to go back to your PostgresSQL conf again and change your log parameters there. Take your backups, test your backups. And this is where I went, oh crap, because I'm used to dealing with a proprietary set of tools. And so I'm used to being able to do point in time. I mean, you can do point in time recoveries with Postgres, but it's a whole other process. And you do need supplemental tools for it. There are some open source options. I'm used to the backup and recovery tool by EDB. So do your due diligence here. The backup tool that comes with Postgres natively. This is kind of similar to taking an export or doing an export and then applying, doing an import to recover. There is a PG-based backup extension that you can do point-in-time recoveries, and I do recommend playing with it. It all depends on the integrity of your WALs. So keep an eye on those too. Make sure that they should be about 10% of your database size. Red flag number 1, an error in your database logs. Red flag number 2, your WALs are significantly greater than 10% of your database, your actual file space. Something is going on. You can look at archiving, but this is where you're probably going to need to ask for help from somebody like me. Users, come back to my slides and look at my cheat sheet. Also, maybe ping me privately on Twitter. My handle is on all the slides. You can also email me, just jessica.sharp@enterprisedba.com. Users are a headache. So roles are not the same as users. They're similar to groups, but you also have groups. Roles are global for the cluster. Groups can be global for the customer. They don't, or cluster, sorry, not customer. They don't have to be. If you're the super user, which if you're logging in as Postgres, you are a super user. Super user is a role that has all the privileges. The other helpful default roles are right here. But these are administrative. Please don't give your application groups or roles access to these. You can apply a user to multiple roles. So don't put your application user in the PG monitor role, and don't give this role to that group, obviously. But when you're creating users, watch out. If it's not super user, watch out for permissions. You have to grant permission. You have to grant connect. Okay, no surprise there. You have to grant usage. Check the documentation on this. Don't miss anything. You're going to end up with some long scripts, and I'm thinking about doing some breakdowns and publishing some publicly available templates, because it's a pain to write these scripts. You have to grant usage on the database. You have to grant usage on the schema, but that doesn't, usage just means access. So if I give my application user usage on, and I have to list out every single schema by schema that I want them to have access to, if they want to add a new function, create a new procedure, insert rows into the tables in that schema, they won't be able to. All I've given them is read access, and that's not necessarily clear in the documentation. It is, but it's not. It's hard. If you're coming from Oracle, you think usage, it trips people up all the time. The other thing that trips people up, especially coming from Oracle, you have to explicitly grant execute on almost every single different object type. So procedures, functions, tables. And I have ended up with 100+ line scripts just to grant proper privileges for anybody that's not a super user. So keep an eye on my GitHub, Sharp DBA. I am going to publish, I need to publish some templates soon because I have a need for them about twice a week. Somebody asks me for something. Do your research. As long as your pgconf is good, cross-reference that with the database level privileges, and you should be good. But I'm learning things all the time. So if you try some of this and you get stuck, please reach out. Please, please, please reach out. Or if you find some documentation, it's usually pretty good, but if it doesn't make sense, please do feel free to reach out. I love getting that feedback, and I absolutely love helping people dig into this because I know some of it's all over the place and it doesn't actually need to be. Once you're familiar with the documentation, after you've been looking at it for a few months, it starts to make more sense, and you get your little helpful knowledge sources. I have digital copies of The Art of Postgres. So for you developers, this is a really cool kind of getting started. It's not very big. It's Dimitri Fontaine. He's very, very much more concise than I am. It's less than 500 pages. If you are interested in a digital copy, I have extras that I have paid for and have permission to share. So reach out. If you want recommendations on books, if you're a DBA or an architect, I have books that help with designing highly available environments. That's the word I'm looking for. And I've also got what's called the Postgres Administration Cookbook. I can send you some links to some of those. I don't have copies of those to distribute, but I can help you get going in the right direction if you've exhausted the Postgres documentation and are at an end with reading the mailing lists. There is also a community Slack channel. Check the postgresql.org page. Anybody can join the Slack channel, and I see basic level intro questions there all the time. People like me are in there answering. So consider requesting access to that as well. And I hope that's helpful. There's a lot more about Postgres that you kind of got to know before you get into it, but it's really a lot to cover, and we are over time already, so thank you. And I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you, Jessica. That was really good.
Oh, I see a question on how to join the Slack channel. Just go to postgresql.org and navigate to, I think it's the About Us or Contact Us. Or there's a page on there. Let me look it up really fast. Community. Go to community and it's in the quick links.
Thanks. Just as a reminder, I put up on the slide, I'm sure everybody can see it, our webinar next week is with Kerry Millsap. If you have not had a chance to see one of his presentations, it's quite amazing. So he's probably one of the foremost experts in Oracle tracing and performance tuning. We've been trying for a long time to get him, so we are quite excited to have him next week. So I hope everybody will go to the COUG site and register for this session, and share with your colleagues and people in your network, because I think it's going to be pretty good. I want to thank Jessica for giving us this really great presentation on Postgres. It's nothing I've ever used before, and I learned a few things about it. I'm now very excited to go try it, as well as 500 other technology things, because my mind is always all over the place. But thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us today. If anyone has any questions or anything for her, I think she's provided her contact information. We will have the YouTube live stream ready. I think it's ready right away, even though it'll say live for a little while. And I will get the slide deck from her and update that on the registration link. You'll see the register button will turn into a little PowerPoint picture, and you can click on that to download her PowerPoint presentation. So I think that's it on the questions. So I think we're good. Thank you, everyone. And we will talk to or see you next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. Bye.